The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory offered no mercy. It was a land where the sun punished without conscience, and the wind cut through flesh and thought alike. Out here, a man's worth was measured not by decency, but by endurance. A woman's survival depended on silence, labor, and luck. The wind came in low, scraping gusts that tasted of rust and distance. It swept through Redemption Creek, a settlement so small and unfinished it barely qualified as a town. Two crooked rows of shacks leaned into the desert's breath like penitents under a divine sentence. The air shimmered with heat, a mirage of movement where nothing truly lived. The dust here was its own kind of witness. It carried the history of struggle, failure, and futile hope. It clung to every board, every nail, every weary soul who hadn't yet found the sense to leave. The general store, its faded sign missing half its paint, served as the only gathering point, a place for trading, gossiping, and judging. On this particular morning, all three acts were in full motion. The crowd gathered, a sparse congregation of faces hardened by drought and disappointment. Men leaned on posts or hitched boots on rails, their expressions carved from the same dry earth they worked. A few women stood at a distance, shawls pulled close around thin shoulders, their eyes sharp with the quiet cruelty of the powerless. In the center of it all, under the unforgiving glare of the sun, Elara Finch stood still, not as a woman, but as a transaction waiting to be completed. She was 26, though the desert had already taken half of her softness and most of her illusions. Her dress, a faded blue relic of a life once more civilized, clung loosely to her thin frame. The hem was stained with travel and old tears. Her hair, once carefully managed, now hung in a loose, dull braid, heavy with dust. Beside her stood her father, Silas Finch, a man whose debts had long since devoured his dignity. His face was the color of tobacco and sunburn, his eyes pale and evasive. The few coins jingling in his pocket made a mockery of the gold he once boasted of striking. He had been many things: prospector, gambler, drunk. But today he was simply a merchant of desperation. And the commodity was his daughter. "She'll work," Silas said, his voice rough, forced into a tone of businesslike detachment. "Hard worker. Quiet hands, knows her stitches." The words sounded rehearsed, mechanical. He had probably practiced them all morning, testing how to sell shame in a way that sounded like survival. His mouth twisted into a parody of seriousness, as if the moral burden of the act was someone else's to carry. Elara's elbow was caught tight in his grip, not cruel, but proprietary. The touch of a man who had long forgotten affection and replaced it with ownership. She didn't flinch. She didn't resist. To do so would have only prolonged the spectacle, the crowd murmured. A few of the older miners spat tobacco into the dust, unimpressed. Someone chuckled quietly, not out of humor, but because discomfort needed an outlet. Elara kept her eyes low. Not out of modesty, but because she had already seen too much of what stared back from the faces around her. That cold, impersonal hunger that people reserve for things, not souls. Her life had become a series of transactions that all ended in loss. A failed marriage back east had left her name whispered in church pews and erased from respectable invitations. The word barren had been whispered behind her back like a curse. She had returned to her father's doorstep with nothing but a valise and a hollowed-out sense of self. Redemption Creek had been the final stop, the place where even hope had a price tag. The dry air pressed against her throat, heavy with judgment and heat. Every breath felt like penance. Silas cleared his throat, gesturing vaguely toward her as though describing livestock. "She's strong. Ain't afraid of hard work. Quiet, too. Won't cause trouble." The audience didn't respond. They simply stared, calculating, evaluating, deciding whether her upkeep would outweigh her worth. Elara's heart beat in slow, painful thuds. The square seemed to tilt slightly under her feet, the sound of wind in her ears merging with the dull rhythm of shame. Somewhere in her mind a small voice begged for escape, but her body stayed still, locked in the quiet dignity of endurance. A piece of paper fluttered across the ground, catching against her shoe before skittering away. She watched it go, strangely envious of its freedom. The sun crept higher. The silence grew heavier. Silas shifted his weight, sensing the moment slipping. "Ain't asking much," he muttered. "Just enough to settle what's owed." No one replied. For a moment, Ilara thought the world might simply end there, in the dull hum of wind and unspoken judgment, until a new sound entered the scene. The steady, deliberate rhythm of boots on packed earth. They were heavy steps, calm and slow, carrying the weight of someone who moved only when he meant to. Every head turned. From the shadow of the blacksmith's awning, a tall figure emerged, silent, deliberate, framed by the dim glow of the forge behind him. The crowd's murmur faltered, replaced by a subtle shift in energy, not fear exactly, but wary acknowledgement. The blacksmith's forge had gone cold hours ago, but its awning still smelled faintly of smoke and scorched metal. From that shadow, a man emerged, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of presence that rearranged the air itself. He was Cain. To the townsfolk, that single name was enough. They said it with the cautious tone reserved for weather or plague, something that could not be controlled, only endured. He was a man carved by the same elements that shaped the canyon walls: relentless wind, grinding sand, the long silence between one thunderclap and the next. His clothes were utilitarian, rough canvas, thick leather patched and oiled against the sun. The coat he wore bore the faded scars of travel and weather, and the revolver at his hip looked older than any lawman in the territory, but it was his eyes that held the crowd, dark, unreadable, reflecting neither hostility nor welcome. They seemed to absorb light rather than return it. He was of mixed blood, Apache mother, white prospector father, and therefore, to the people of Redemption Creek, he belonged nowhere. Too dark for the townsmen, too pale for the tribes, too self-contained for both. And yet, in the brutal logic of the West, a man who owed allegiance to no one was often the only one truly free. The murmurs thinned out as he crossed the dusty ground toward Silas Finch. Boots scuffed against gravel. The only other sound was the rasping wind. Even the stray dog that usually loitered by the saloon went silent. Sensing the shift in mood, Cain stopped directly in front of Silas, not bothering to glance at Ilara. His presence alone seemed to push the older man back half a step. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, with the unhurried motion of someone accustomed to decisive gestures, Cain reached into his coat and drew out a small, heavy pouch. He set it on the rickety table between them. The soft thud of gold dust in rough leather carried more finality than any word could. The crowd leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Gold, true gold, not promise notes, not script, was a rare sight in Redemption Creek. It smelled faintly metallic, a scent that turned every man's stomach to greed. Silas's eyes flicked toward it, his throat working. His fingers twitched. "That'll do," he said too quickly, voice cracked by eagerness. His false dignity melted away in an instant. He reached out, fumbling to pull the pouch toward him, the rasp of the drawstring loud in the tense air. Cain didn't move. "Didn't blink. You know the terms, Cain?" Silas said, forcing a brittle laugh that came out more like a cough. "No returns. She's not a soft thing. Hard life's made her what she is." "The terms are known," Cain replied. His voice was deep, low, like the growl of thunder rolling over far-off mesas. It carried no anger, no warmth, just weight. Each word dropped into the dust and stayed there. He finally turned his gaze toward Ilara. For a moment she thought he might find her lacking, too fragile, too thin, too obviously bruised by failure. But his eyes didn't search her. They didn't appraise, they simply acknowledged. It was the look one might give a tool before deciding if it could hold up under strain. It was the first look in years that hadn't carried pity or disdain. Cain's face was unreadable, the faintest hint of exhaustion in the lines around his mouth. His expression was one of complete control, but his silence was not empty. It was purposeful, like a door closed to protect something behind it. "I need a steady hand for my young ones," he said simply. Nothing more. The words struck like a stone dropped into still water, plain, cold, and impossible to misinterpret. Ilara's breath caught, but she said nothing. There was no permission to speak, and none needed. Her voice would change nothing. Silas hesitated only long enough to tuck the gold pouch into his coat pocket. The false solemnity he had worn earlier vanished entirely. "You heard the man," he muttered, releasing Alara's arm with a careless flick, as though casting off a minor burden. The sudden absence of his grip left her momentarily unbalanced, a small, physical symbol of a far greater disorientation. For years, her life had been guided by others' choices, her father's debts, her husband's impatience, society's whispered verdicts. Now she had been bought, not rescued, not freed, but exchanged like currency. And yet, for reasons she could not articulate, the transaction didn't feel like a death sentence. It felt like a strange reprieve. Cain turned without ceremony and began to walk back toward the waiting wagon near the blacksmith's post. His movements were deliberate, economical, the stride of a man who did not waste energy. The crowd parted as he passed, not out of respect, but self-preservation. Alara stood for one last heartbeat in the center of the square. The wind lifted the loose strands of her hair, dust swirling around her boots. She felt the gazes of the townsfolk pressing into her back, sharp as needles, each one a tiny wound. Then she bent down, picked up her small cloth satchel, her entire life, compressed into a few square inches of worn fabric, and followed him. No one called after her. The people of Redemption Creek returned to their routines as though the entire exchange had been a brief, unremarkable interruption in the long monotony of survival. But Alara knew something had shifted, not in them, but in herself. For the first time in years, she was moving away from judgment. Away from the place where her worth had been publicly measured and found wanting. The wagon waited, plain, sturdy, the boards sun-bleached and scarred by years of use. Cain climbed into the driver's seat, taking the reins with calm familiarity. He did not offer her a hand, and she did not expect one. She climbed aboard on her own, settling on the opposite side of the bench, hands clasped tightly in her lap as the wagon lurched forward, leaving the town's crooked roofs and gossiping shadows behind. The wind shifted again. It carried with it the faint echo of the marketplace, of her father's voice, of the finality of the bargain. And as Redemption Creek faded into the shimmering horizon, Alara felt, for the first time, the unfamiliar weight of silence that did not condemn. It was not kindness, but it was something like mercy. The wagon rolled westward, into the blinding heart of the desert, where names and debts alike were burned away by distance and dust. The wagon creaked like an old prayer as it rolled westward. Each turn of the wheel groaned beneath the weight of heat and silence. Behind them, Redemption Creek shrank into a shimmer, a collection of warped boards and human noise dissolving into the mirage of the desert. Ahead lay the untamed sprawl of the Arizona Territory, its horizons sharp as a knife's edge and just as unforgiving. The road, if it could be called that, was a faint track etched into dust and rock. It led not toward comfort, but deeper into the marrow of solitude. Alara sat rigid on the bench beside Cain, her fingers locked together, her eyes fixed on the shifting horizon. She did not dare speak, not out of fear, but because the man beside her carried silence like a weapon, and she could sense that to break it prematurely would be an offense she couldn't afford. The horses moved at a steady, patient gait, intelligent beasts that seemed to understand their master's rhythm. Their hooves struck a dry, hollow percussion against the earth, like a heartbeat stretched across eternity. Hours passed, marked only by the slow movement of the sun. At first, the silence between them was oppressive, heavy, like a weight pressing down on her chest. But as the miles wore on, that silence began to change. It became a boundary she could inhabit, a place where words were unnecessary, where her shame and his mystery existed without collision. The land unfolded in brutal beauty. Low mesas rose in the distance, their cliffs painted in layered reds and ochres, like the inside of some ancient wound. Skeletal bushes clung stubbornly to life. The air shimmered with heat so dense it bent light itself. Occasionally, a hawk circled overhead, its cry slicing through the stillness before fading into the empty blue. Cain handled the reins with a practiced calm. His posture was rigid but not tense, the bearing of someone shaped by labor, not arrogance. Every movement was purposeful. When the wheel hit a rut, he adjusted without swearing, without complaint. When the horses faltered, he clicked his tongue once softly, and they obeyed. He was a man who expected competence from himself, from his animals, and perhaps one day, from her. Alara risked a glance at him. His profile was stark in the sunlight, a straight nose, high cheekbones, the glint of sweat along his temple. His eyes, narrowed against the glare, scanned the horizon with unblinking focus. There was a gravity to him that both comforted and unsettled her. At last, as the afternoon heat began to dull into amber, she found her voice. "You paid a great deal," she said quietly. The words felt strange in her mouth, dry, cautious. "Enough gold to hire any woman in town. Or 3. For a moment she thought he hadn't heard. Then, without turning his head, he answered. "I work the mines," he said, "up in the hills beyond Devil's Spine." His voice was low and even, shaped by years of solitude. "The mountains take. They also steal time. I have 2 young ones, Jude 6, Maya 12. They need care that doesn't vanish when I ride out. They need constancy, not fear." He said the names, Jude, Maya, with the careful weight of a man who had repeated them to himself through long nights, as both promise and prayer. Alara nodded slightly, unsure what response was expected. She had no children of her own, and never would. But she recognized the quiet desperation in his words. The same desperation that had driven him to the edge of town to buy a stranger's labor. The sun began to sink behind the mesas, bleeding color into the horizon. The air cooled, carrying the faint smell of mesquite and dust. Shadows stretched long and thin across the ground. When they finally stopped for water, Cain dismounted first. He moved with an economy of motion, untying the canteen, checking the harness, running a steady hand along the horse's flanks. Alara climbed down awkwardly, her legs stiff from hours of stillness. He offered her the canteen without a word. She hesitated, then took it, the cool metal biting pleasantly against her palm. She drank, careful not to take too much. The water was tepid but clean, and in this land, that meant luxury. As she handed it back, she noticed his hands. They were large and scarred, the kind that had known both creation and destruction. A long, pale mark ran across his left palm, not fresh, but old and smooth, like a healed burn. She wondered briefly what had caused it, then quickly looked away, ashamed of her curiosity. They rode again at dusk. The world turned violet and silver, the first stars trembling faintly in the vastness above. Coyotes called in the distance, high, mournful notes that sounded almost human. By the time the last light drained from the sky, the air had cooled enough for breath to fog faintly in front of them. Cain slowed the wagon and finally spoke again. "We'll reach home before full dark." Home. The word caught in Alara's mind. Foreign, fragile. It had been years since that word meant anything more than a rented room or a memory she could no longer afford. When the wagon crested the final rise, she saw it, nestled in a shallow basin below. Half sheltered by a cottonwood and the curve of the land, stood a small adobe cabin. It was rough and uneven, built with hands that had prioritized survival over comfort. The roof sagged slightly under a patchwork of tin and timber, and smoke rose thinly from a short clay chimney. Beside it ran a trickle of water, a spring, clear and narrow, cutting a silver thread through the dust. Around it, someone had attempted a meager garden, a few rows of corn, wild sage, and what looked like beans. The soil was hard, but stubbornly green in places. It was not a home built for beauty, but for endurance. Cain brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down. His boots struck the earth with a dull, familiar finality. He began unfastening the harnesses, moving with the quiet confidence of someone returning to the only world that made sense to him. Alara sat frozen for a long moment, staring at the cabin. The air here was cooler, touched with the scent of running water and damp clay. Yet beneath that calm was a deep, unsettling isolation. The silence was so complete, it pressed against her ears. This place was a kind of exile. and also perhaps a beginning. When she finally stepped down, her feet sank slightly into the soft dust. She could hear the faint sound of laughter, children's laughter, from inside the cabin. Then the low murmur of a voice. Kane looked toward her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "This is it," he said. "You'll find what needs doing soon enough." He didn't say welcome. He didn't have to. Out here, survival was welcome enough. Alara nodded faintly, clutching the small satchel that now felt even lighter, emptier. She took in the cracked clay walls, the lonely cottonwood, the faint glimmer of the spring. And beneath all that, the slow, terrifying realization that she had reached the end of every known road. Here, she would either become necessary, or she would disappear. The sky above them deepened to black, and the first cold stars began to burn. The wagon came to a stop with a weary groan, dust curling around the wheels like smoke. Alara sat for a heartbeat before moving, her legs stiff and her nerves sharper than they'd been all day. The journey had drained her, but this, meeting the children, was the true test. Kane climbed down first. He didn't look back to help her, but he didn't walk off either. That was his way, silent allowance. Alara followed, her boots sinking into the cool, damp soil by the spring. The cabin was small, but it carried signs of life. A stack of neatly split firewood, a rope strung with drying herbs, and the faint light of a lamp flickering behind a worn curtain. The smell of smoke and sage hung in the air. A soft creak sounded as the door opened. 2 figures stood in the threshold, framed by the amber glow within. The girl appeared first, Maya, 12, maybe 13, her small frame hardened by work and willpower. Her long braids were tight, her eyes sharper than any adult's in the county. She looked straight at Alara, not with curiosity, but with challenge. The kind of gaze that measured weakness before offering anything resembling trust. Behind her, half hidden in her skirt, stood Jude, a boy of 6, all round eyes and quiet fear. His hand clutched the fabric like it was a lifeline. Kane's voice cut gently through the silence. "This is Alara," he said. "She stays." The words landed like a nail driven into wood. Final, practical, absolute. Maya didn't move. She just narrowed her eyes, her jaw tightening. "We don't need a woman," she said flatly, her voice small but fierce. "We manage fine." Alara met that glare with quiet patience. There was no anger in her, only understanding. This girl had been holding up a house too heavy for her age, and Alara knew what that did to a soul. Jude peeked from behind his sister, his lips pressed tight, his expression unreadable. Inside, the single room was warm and dim. A rough-hewn table dominated the center, and the walls bore the marks of many seasons. Patched cracks, a child's drawing in charcoal, a shelf of old jars holding precious bits of seed and flour. Everything spoke of survival, not comfort. Alara set her satchel by the door. The air smelled of beans and smoke, and the faint trace of a woman's perfume, old, ghost-like, still lingered. That scent told her everything she needed to know. There had once been a mother here, and her absence still ruled the room. Maya stayed silent, guarding the hearth like a sentry. Jude edged closer to the table, eyes darting between his father and the stranger. Kane broke the moment with the blunt practicality of a man who lived by rhythm. "Water's in the barrel out back. Fire needs tending come morning. You'll know what to do." He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He simply nodded once and stepped outside, the door creaking closed behind him. In his absence, the silence deepened. Only the crack of the fire and the ticking of an unseen clock filled the space. Alara stood there, feeling the weight of the girl's gaze and the fragile tremor of the boy's fear. She could sense it clearly, the boundaries drawn in that small room. One of mistrust, one of grief, and one faint flickering space in between where she just might belong. The days that followed were not peace. They were negotiation, quiet, constant, and wordless. Alara rose before dawn, the chill of the desert night still biting her skin. She moved softly through the small cabin, careful not to wake the children, learning the space by instinct, the uneven boards, the rhythm of the wind through the cracks. the sigh of the spring outside. When the first light touched the cottonwood, she began her work. She swept the floor, her strokes even and steady. By mid-morning, Maya would appear, silent as a hawk, take the broom from her hand, and re-sweep the same stretch of plank with sharp, deliberate strokes. It wasn't correction, it was possession. The girl guarding what little she still controlled, Alara said nothing. She only nodded and moved to the next task. The first loaf of bread she baked came out hard enough to break teeth. Maya smirked, said nothing, and cooked her own, the smell of warm yeast and confidence filling the cabin like proof of authority. Alara took her failure quietly, slicing her rock-hard loaf into crumbs for the chickens. Her stitches were worse. The first pair of Jude's trousers she tried to mend left her fingers raw and bleeding, a smear of red blooming on the fabric like an accusation. Still, she tied off the thread, washed the stain, and folded them neat. Jude began watching her more after that, careful, wide-eyed. He didn't speak, but his silence was softer than his sister's. The evenings were the hardest. The desert cooled, the wind turned sharp, and the little house gathered shadows. Kine sat on the porch, sharpening tools or mending tack, his presence steady and unbending. He rarely spoke to any of them, but his silence filled the space like structure, holding it together. Inside, Alara moved about the fire, trying not to disturb Maya's invisible borders, the cupboard, the hearth, the old chair by the wall that had once belonged to a mother. She had learned something crucial in those early days. In this house, silence was the only language that counted. Maya's eyes followed her constantly, measuring each movement. It wasn't hatred, Alara realized. It was fear. Fear that this stranger might replace a memory too precious to touch. So Alara worked without intrusion, speaking only when needed, answering softly, staying visible but not loud. Her patience became her rebellion, Kine noticed. He didn't praise, didn't interfere, didn't stop Maya's testing. But sometimes, when Alara carried water from the spring or stacked wood outside, she felt his gaze from the porch, quietly appraising, as if marking her endurance like the desert marked its stones. By the week's end, Alara's hands were blistered, her back ached, and the edges of her shame had worn smooth. Each small failure taught her the rhythm of this place, the stubborn balance between survival and pride. One night, when she thought the children were asleep, Alara knelt by the hearth to stir the embers. The faint crackle sounded like breath. From the loft above, she heard Maya whisper to her brother, the girl's tone grudging but faintly changed. "She doesn't quit, does she?" A pause, then Jude's sleepy murmur, "She's not like before." Alara smiled to herself. Unseen, a quiet ember glowing inside her chest. The war was far from over, but for the first time, she had a foothold on the battlefield. The desert had been cruel before, but that afternoon it turned feral. The sky shifted first, from gold to bruised purple, as if the light itself had soured. The air, once dry and brittle, grew heavy and metallic. Even the spring by the cabin, usually a thread of calm, began to murmur with unease. Kane had left early that morning for the mines, a 2-day ride across the ridge. He'd said little, only a nod to Alara, and a quiet word to Maya to keep the fire. When he disappeared beyond the rise, the silence he left behind felt too large. By late afternoon, the air was wrong. The cottonwood shuddered without wind. Birds fled the canyon, their cries sharp and urgent. The children grew restless, Jude clinging close, Maya pacing like an animal that senses the coming trap. Then came the sound. At first it was distant, a dull rumble, like thunder rolling under the ground. But it grew, fast, louder, closer, a sound that didn't belong to the sky, but to the earth itself. Alara stepped onto the porch, and her heart froze. Down the narrow wash that cut through the basin, a wall of water, thick, brown and wild, was tearing its way toward them. A flash flood, born from the mountains, sudden and merciless. The air filled with the roar of it, the scent of mud and lightning. "Maya!" Alara shouted. "Get Jude! Inside!" But the girl was already outside, barefoot in the mud, clutching her brother and staring toward the corral. "The chickens," she cried, panic cracking through her voice. "They'll drown!" Elara looked. The coop sat low, barely above the rushing current that was now surging closer with every heartbeat. "They'll be gone in a minute," Maya yelled, trying to pull free. Elara didn't think. She stripped off her apron, dropped her shawl, and ran. The rain hit in sheets, cold and violent, slicing her vision into fragments. Mud clung to her skirt, dragging her down. The roar was deafening, a constant living growl. The coop was already half submerged, the chickens flapping and screeching in blind terror. She waded in. The current hit her knees, then her thighs, cold as stone. Her boots sank, the pull of the water fierce enough to knock her off balance. She reached the coop, grabbed the latch, and yanked it open just as a wave slammed against it. Wood splintered. Mud swallowed her feet. She fought it, teeth clenched, forcing her body to stay upright. The birds burst out, chaos and feathers and sound, but she caught them, two at a time, clutching their slick bodies against her chest. They kicked, scratched, pecked, but she held on, stumbling back toward higher ground. Behind her, the coop shuddered again, then gave way entirely, ripped from its foundation, and swept down the canyon in a swirl of debris. By the time Elara reached the porch, she was soaked through, shaking with exhaustion. She fell to her knees, setting the terrified birds inside a crate near the door. Her breath came ragged, her hands raw and bleeding. Maya stood there, frozen, rain running down her face. The defiance in her eyes was gone, washed away with the dust of the storm. All that was left was shock and something new, respect. "You didn't have to," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're just chickens. We could have—" She trailed off, realizing the lie halfway through. Elara looked up, water dripping from her hair, her lips pale but steady. "They were yours," she said simply. "That's reason enough." For a long moment, none of them spoke. The flood thundered by, carrying the remnants of the coop down into the black mouth of the canyon. The storm raged, but inside that small circle of light, something shifted, something invisible but permanent. The girl who had refused help now stood beside the woman who had risked herself without hesitation. And the boy clutching Elara's arm had stopped trembling. Outside, the desert roared. Inside, a family began to take shape, fragile, wet but unbroken. The storm spent itself by dawn. When the first thin light broke over the canyon rim, the desert looked gutted, torn open and rearranged. The creek bed had doubled in size, the cottonwood roots exposed like gnarled bones. Mud streaked the cabin walls. The coop was gone entirely, nothing left but splinters caught in the sagebrush. Elara woke stiff and feverish, every muscle screaming. Her palms were raw, her ankles swollen from where she'd twisted it in the current. Yet when she pushed herself upright, the first thing she saw was the box near the hearth, the rescued chickens, huddled and alive, steam rising from their feathers. Maya was crouched beside them, feeding them bits of dried corn. The girl's hair hung loose, her face still streaked with dirt. When she noticed Elara stirring, she hesitated, then whispered, "They made it." Elara nodded, her throat dry. "We all did." Jude crawled closer, pressing a warm hand against her arm. "You were in the river," he said softly, as if confirming something impossible. "It tried to take you." "It tried," she murmured, forcing a faint smile. "But I didn't let it." For the rest of the morning, the three of them worked in silence, clearing debris, wringing out blankets, setting the cabin to rights. Every motion was slow and deliberate, like penance. The desert sun returned with its usual cruelty, burning away the night's wetness, but it couldn't erase what had happened. By midday, Elara's body rebelled. Fever crept in like a thief, blurring the edges of the world. She made it as far as the porch before her legs gave out. Maya was there instantly, catching her by the shoulders with surprising strength. "You should rest," the girl said. "You've done enough." Elara almost laughed. The words sounded strange coming from her. But the sincerity in Maya's tone stopped her. She allowed herself to be guided inside, lowered onto a cot near the fire. The room smelled of smoke and wet clay. Jude tucked a blanket around her, his small face drawn with worry. For the first time since Redemption Creek, Ilara let herself close her eyes without fear of what morning might demand. When Cain returned the next evening, the valley bore scars of the flood. The trail was carved deep with new ruts, and debris hung from the low branches like crude flags. His horse snorted nervously at the scent of ruin. He dismounted, eyes scanning the cabin. The coop was gone. The ground near the door was churned into mud. Smoke still curled from the chimney, but faintly. Maya met him halfway down the path. She wasn't the same girl he'd left. The suspicion in her gaze had been replaced by something harder to define. "She's inside," she said. "Resting." "She hurt her leg." Cain's jaw tightened. "Tell me." The words came out clipped, but she obeyed, recounting every detail. The storm, the flood, the rescue. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but a tremor crept in when she reached the part where Ilara vanished into the rain. She ended simply. She didn't stop until the last bird was safe. Cain said nothing for a long time. He walked past her into the cabin. Ilara lay by the fire, half awake, her ankle wrapped in linen, her face pale with exhaustion. When she saw him, she tried to sit up, but he raised a hand. "Stay," he said quietly. The word held command and care in equal measure. He knelt beside her, examining the bandage. His fingers were rough but gentle, tracing the swollen joint with practiced skill. The silence stretched until the crackle of the fire became the only sound. Finally, he spoke. "Why?" She met his gaze, the fever bright in her eyes. "Because someone had to." "That's not an answer," he said evenly. "You risked yourself for what can be replaced." Ilara swallowed, her voice low but steady. "I know what it is to be left behind when something is lost. I won't let your children feel that, not if I can stop it." She paused, gathering breath. "All my life, people have called me useless. I was determined not to prove them right again." Something shifted in his expression, a subtle softening, not pity but understanding. He reached for her hand, turning it palm up. The scar there, faint and smooth, caught the firelight. His thumb brushed it once. "You saved them," he said simply. It wasn't a question. Ilara closed her eyes. "We saved each other, I think." Cain said nothing more. He stood, crossed to the hearth, and added wood to the fire. Behind him, Maya quietly set a bowl of broth beside Ilara's cot. For the first time, she didn't avert her eyes. Outside, the night wind moved gently through the cottonwood, its leaves whispering over the scarred earth. The flood had taken much, but it had also washed something clean. The dust had settled. The silence, once heavy with judgment, now felt like peace. By morning, the fever had broken. The cabin smelled of sage and smoke, the air cool after the storm. Outside, the world was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a battle already won. Cain sat beside Ilara's cot, his hat in his hands, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. He had inspected the damage, the ruined coop, the widened creek, but none of it mattered now. The gold he'd spent to buy her had never bought this. Maya stood nearby, silent as a shadow. When Cain asked what had happened, she told him again, this time with a steadier voice. "She didn't stop," she said simply, even when the water came up to her waist. Cain turned to Ilara. "You should have stayed inside," he said quietly, though there was no anger in it. Ilara's voice was rough, but firm. "I couldn't. You said your children needed care that didn't come from fear. That's all I tried to give." He studied her, eyes unreadable. "You risked yourself for a few chickens. They were theirs," she answered. "And I couldn't let them lose anything more." For a long moment, the only sound was the fire's low crackle. Then Cain reached out, resting his calloused hand over hers. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of something unspoken. "You've done more than I asked," he said at last. "More than I deserved to ask." Maya looked between them, her expression softening. Not quite affection yet, but respect, the beginning of trust. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet earth and new life. The desert, brutal and beautiful, had taken much, but it had given something back. Weeks passed. The flood left behind richer soil and a rhythm the cabin slowly returned to. The days no longer felt like penance but purpose, Ilara's limp faded. Her hands grew strong and certain, kneading bread, mending shirts, coaxing stubborn seeds into life. The small flock thrived again, clucking softly near the rebuilt pen. Maya no longer hovered with suspicion. She watched, learned, and sometimes even laughed, quick, quiet bursts that startled everyone. Jude followed Ilara everywhere, a shadow in bare feet, his small voice finally bright with comfort. One evening, as the heat drained from the land, Cain sat on the porch, carving wood as he often did. Ilara joined him, her sewing in hand, the silence between them calm and familiar. "You could leave," Cain said finally, not looking up. "Take the gold you've earned. Tucson's close enough now. You could start again." Ilara paused, needle poised midair. "I thought about it," she said softly. "But starting over doesn't mean anything if you have to start alone." He nodded slowly. No argument, no persuasion, just understanding. Inside, Jude's laughter echoed faintly. Outside, the desert settled into its endless dusk. Ilara breathed it in, the scent of dust, firewood, and bread. For the first time in years, the air didn't taste of shame. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was home. Winter came slow and quiet. The river's roar was gone, leaving only the echo of what had been. The cabin stood firm, scarred but whole, like the people inside it. Ilara stirred stew over the fire. Cain sharpened a knife beside her, the rhythm of steel against stone almost musical. Jude sprawled nearby, tracing pictures in the ash on the floor. Maya emerged from the barn, hair streaked with hay and sunlight. She smiled, small, unguarded. The tension that had ruled them all melted like frost under morning light. Ilara looked. Around in the cabin, the land, the small, stubborn family she had chosen. The reckoning had passed. What remained was iron, ash, and life rebuilt from both. She stepped outside, the chill brushing her cheeks. The horizon stretched wide, empty, yet full. Somewhere beyond it lay Tucson, gold and possibility. But here lay something steadier, belonging. She turned back. Cain met her gaze. No words were needed. Jude waved, and Maya's laughter broke the quiet. The past could haunt them no longer. They had survived it. They had chosen each other, and for once, survival was enough. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this story. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me keep bringing you more heartfelt stories like this. Your support means the world.